We learned of additional intrusions into Internet platforms. Those private sector strikes follow especially damaging attacks on our federal government, including the extensive SolarWinds hack earlier this year. While the objectives of these attacks differ, they all demonstrate that bad actors, whether criminal organizations or foreign governments, are always looking to exploit the weakest link, infiltrate networks, steal information, and disrupt American life. Mr. Brown, I'm glad your company continues to recover from this malicious attack and that the FBI was able to recover millions of dollars in ransom paid. But I am alarmed that this breach ever occurred in the first place and that communities from Texas to New York suffered as a result. I appreciate that you have joined us today to provide answers to the committee and the American people on how a group of criminals was able to infiltrate your networks, steal nearly 100 gigabytes of data in just 2 hours, and then lock your systems with ransomware to demand payment. I'm also looking forward to hearing an update on your progress to recover from this serious breach. Private entities, especially those that are critical to our nation's infrastructure, are responsible for assessing their individual risk and investing in the technology to prevent breaches and to ensure that they can continue to provide service to customers who rely on them for basic necessities like fuel. At the same time, the federal government must develop a comprehensive, all-of-government approach to not only defend against cyber attacks, but punish foreign adversaries who continue to perpetrate them or harbor criminal organizations that target American systems. This approach requires bolstering our defenses and using the full might of our diplomatic, military, and intelligence capabilities. We must also ensure private entities like Colonial are providing the federal government with timely and relevant information in the event of a major incident. We need federal agencies charged with cybersecurity like the Department of Homeland Security and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency to understand the extent of these attacks and how best to support victims. Make no mistake, if we do not step up our cybersecurity readiness, the consequences will be severe. The ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline affected millions of Americans. The next time an incident like this happens, unfortunately, it could be even worse. As chairman of this committee, I'm committed to prioritizing policies that will help secure our critical infrastructure networks, including in the proposed infrastructure package Congress is now negotiating. Protecting the American people from these sophisticated, harmful, and growing attacks will not be easy. We must learn from our past mistakes, find out what went wrong, and work together to tackle this enormous challenge. Inaction, however, is simply not an option. With that, I'll turn it over to Ranking Member Portman for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Blount, thank you for being here today. We're going to get into some tough questioning, and unfortunately, what happened to your company is not an isolated incident. We've had some good bipartisan work over the years to improve cybersecurity on this committee with you, Senator Peters, with you, Senator Johnson, and others. And yet, let's face it, there's a lot more to do. And what happened with regard to Colonial Pipeline is one example. This is about ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure. And that's the topic of the hearing broadly today. This paralyzes a company by locking its computer systems, holding its data and operations hostage until ransom is paid. Interestingly, these ransoms are not just on the company itself, typically. Increasingly, the hackers also pursue a two-pronged ransom approach where they download and threaten to release sensitive victim data. So individuals, say your customers, may also have been subject to ransomware. There seems to be a new ransomware attack every week. We're going to hear today again about Colonial Pipeline and some of the details there. But no entity, public or private, is safe from these attacks. Last week, we learned that ransomware shut down the world's largest meat processor, JBS, including 9 beef plants in the United States. Both the Colonial pipeline attack and JBS attacks were attributed to a Russian criminal organization, by the way. Just this morning, news broke that a constituent outreach services platform that nearly 60 offices in the United States Congress, the House of Representatives, uses was hit with a ransomware attack. As I've said before, no one is safe from these attacks, including us. I hope that we'll cover 4 specific areas here today. One is we've got to understand that these attacks have real-world consequences. On May 7th, Colonial Pipeline learned they suffered a ransomware attack impacting their information technology or IT systems by this Russian-based criminal group called DarkSide. Recent news reports indicate that hackers accessed Colonial system through a compromised password of a virtual private network account. This account did not use multi-factor authentication, which is a very basic cybersecurity best practice. We'll talk more about that, why they didn't. And this easily allowed the hackers to gain access. Colonial moved quickly to disconnect their operational system to prevent hackers from moving laterally and accessing those systems. That, of course, although an appropriate response to a cyber attack, made Colonial's critical pipelines unusable. And that was a huge problem. So real-world consequences. 45% of the East Coast fuel was coming from Colonial. With operations shut down, people across the East Coast bought fuel in a panic, unsure how long the shortage would last. A lot of service stations ran out of fuel altogether. So people couldn't get gas, couldn't get to work. And, of course, prices skyrocketed. Again, real-world consequences. Second, I hope today we'll talk about how this shows the difficult decision ransomware victims face, should they pay the ransom or not. The U.S. government has a position on this. Both CISA at the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI strongly recommend organizations do not pay ransoms. Why? Because paying ransoms rewards ransomware hackers. If no one paid ransoms, criminals would have little incentive to engage in ransomware attacks. And even if an entity pays, there is no guarantee that the hackers will give them the decryption key or not strike again. And we'll talk more about that, too, in terms of this incident. However, organizations obviously have to weigh these consequences against keeping the operations offline, in this case, limiting 45% of the East Coast fuel supply. Colonial Pipeline paid DarkSide a ransom, we're told, of 75 bitcoins, worth over $4 million at the time. Yesterday, the good news is the Department of Justice announced the recovery of 63.7 of those bitcoins, but DOJ won't be able to recover those ransom payments in other cases. So we'll talk more about that and how they did it and what that means. I appreciate Mr. Blount's transparency in acknowledging that his company paid the $4.4 million in ransom. I hope today we can explore the reasons for that decision. Third, this attack demonstrates the gaps in information sharing between these impacted organizations and the federal government. Last month, Brandon Wales was before us in that very seat. He's the acting director of CISA. He testified in response to one of my questions that he didn't think Colonial Pipeline would have contacted CISA at all if the FBI didn't bring it to them. CISA's authorities allow the agency to engage on a voluntary basis when requested by an affected organization. And CISA has the federal government's best practices is how to deal with these cyber attacks, and it was set up at Department of Homeland Security for that purpose. Well, I think that CISA being able to engage is the right approach. They must have relevant information to be able to share it among other critical infrastructure owners.